it's very doable. For a person who wants to live in France, there's usually a visa that we can find for them. There's basically 4 routes into France: via studies, via work, via relationship, or via the long stay visitor visa. And visitor visa ends up being the route for about half of my clients.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have a very exciting episode with Daniel Tostado. It's very dense, but it's a lot of information that is very, very useful if you have the dream of living in France.
He talks about how to make that dream a reality, and it's totally possible. That's the thing I really want to get across here is it seems like such a foreign concept to move to France as an American citizen, but it's totally possible. And he talks about all of the ways that you can do it, whether you're a student, whether you just want to have an extended vacation, if you're a digital nomad family, or even if you want to retire.
Yeah, this episode is for anyone of any age. If you're working, looking for a job, student, he talks about all the details of how you can actually live abroad in France and all the different visa options. Now, Daniel is very interesting because he is a French attorney and an American attorney from California. He's been living in France for the past 9 years, a brand new father. Congratulations, Daniel, on that. But yes, if you have any interest at all, even just curious about the idea. I mean, one of the things that's shocking to a lot of people is we dive into the details about if you decide to spend time in France, be it move or stay past that 3-month visa, what benefits you get. Because as Americans, the idea of free healthcare is just mind-blowing. And we open that book and tell you exactly what benefits you get in the social services from France.
And do you have to pay taxes? Do you have to pay French taxes as a U.S. citizen? I mean, all of these questions that I think come up for anybody that's interested in living abroad, we answer them. And with an attorney. So everything is fact-checked, guys.
Yes. So hope you guys enjoy this episode with Daniel Tostado.
Welcome to the podcast, Daniel. I'm so excited to have you here to talk all things France and how to get our fellow American citizens over to France if that's what they would like to do. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You're an American living in France.
Well, I'm actually a Franco-American because as of last year, as of 2023 now, I became a French citizen. So I have both passports and I've won the game. So I'm from San Diego, California. That's where I was born and raised. And I didn't even start learning French until I was 19 in university. And then I got into it and I felt like tested at a couple different locations, but I felt like France was the best place for me and that Paris is the best version of France, in my opinion. And so I decided to become a lawyer with the goal of becoming a French lawyer. So I did American law school just in case I wasn't good enough for France. I didn't want to get rejected from the French system. So I did American law school first, finished it with French law school, sat for the New York bar, got it, sat for the Paris bar, got it. And now I am tranquil. I'm a French practicing lawyer, and my entire practice is helping folks make the move here to France, like myself. Very often my clients are American, just like I am. And so, yeah, what I do professionally is help people get visas, residency permits, and naturalization. And I see it effectively as my vocation. I feel called to help people navigate France. And if they love France like I love France, that they can call it home and that I can help them with that process.
This is amazing. This is
That's beautiful.
A man of many talents that we have right here.
Yeah.
And when you took the French bar, I'm assuming that was in French as well, right?
Yeah, it was a 4-day test and it was in French.
Wow. And so the schooling to take the French bar, is it as intense as as an American attorney? Is it basically equal?
Yeah. With the difference that with my American knowledge, on the U.S. side, we deal with the common law, so judge-made law. And on the French side, it's the Code Civil, the Code Napoleonique. So it's an entirely different set of approach to how one handles justice. So it was also kind of like relearning how to bicycle. But it's one of those things living here in France that you don't necessarily have to know every noun and every verb for every subject. So they call that T-shaped intelligence. You've got a good, broad, general intelligence, and then a very narrow, deep dive on a field. So I've got the 50 nouns and verbs for French law. I can sound very intelligent as a lawyer. And then when my plumber comes, he starts talking about attaching la douillette to la gouttière, and I'm just lost because I don't have those vocabulary. So it's okay for me to not have a perfect mastery of every French word to thrive here.
Now, what drove what inspired you to your love of France? How did that start?
I don't have a good answer to that question. I've always just found myself attracted to it, and I found like I like life better here in France. And I think a lot of Americans can connect with that. There is, I'd say, the first blush version of France where you see the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the Notre Dame, which was just got reopened last month. Um, and then there's the reality version of France, which is if once you live here, then you have to deal with the administration. The local prefectures are like the DMV for immigration. You kind of have to realize, why do French banks not like you? Why does your landlord not like you? It's a lot of these matters of navigating. Sometimes they're cultural divides, and sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out that it just takes a little while to readjust to the new place.
Well said.
Yes.
Now, how long have you been in France and living in France?
9 years now.
10 years.
Yeah, 9 years.
Oh, 9 years. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And have you called Paris home that whole time?
I tested out a couple different sides of it. So my first 2 months I was down in the Pyrenees doing some volunteer work. And then I tried out La Réunion, which is a French overseas island by Madagascar. For 8 months, I was a school teacher down there. And then it's not France, but I was in Morocco for 3 months doing asylum law. And a little bit in Madagascar as well, seeing various sides of what ends up getting into the ingredients in the melting pot that is modern day France, and always knowing that you pass through Paris to get to anywhere in France, even including overseas territories. Paris being almost like on a bicycle wheel, the central hub is Paris. And so I always felt like my destiny was driving me back towards Paris itself. If you're trying to get, for example, from Nice to Bordeaux, both in the south of France, but one's on the east, one's in the west, you don't just go across the south of France. You go up to Paris and then back down to the other side of it. So yeah, I always saw myself here, and I'm glad that I've been able to do that. And now every day I get to walk the streets of Paris. And there's a thing that I call, you might relate to this, I call it la vacance, lifecation, that you live where you're going to live. Let's say you're living abroad. And then every Saturday and Sunday, it's like you get a weekend in Paris. Every weekend. So, usually as Americans, we get 2 weeks of unpaid holidays. Here in France, it's minimum 5 weeks of paid holidays, and sometimes up to 9 weeks, like my wife, who's lucky. But then that doesn't even count for the weekends. So if we're here in Paris, we're traveling around, we're gallivanting across Europe because the train system is so well located. You see how excited I am about this thing?
I can feel like
for 9 years. Yeah. I'm enthusiastic.
Oh, that's so beautiful. That's what you would hope for in life,
yes, I
right?
can feel the passion coming out of the screen.
And now you just took your paternity leave as well, right?
That's right.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So I have, thank you, a new son. He is now 2 months, almost 3 months, 2 months old. Let's see if you can see him on
We're looking at a picture right now for all of you that can't see.
Oh, I don't know if it was
so beautiful. Not, there's video as well.
And it's lovely. Now, in France, the standard for women is 16 months of maternity leave, and that for men, about 6 years ago, was only 2 weeks of leave, which is not that much. And then they increased it under Macron to 4 weeks. I still find that not enough. So within my own law firm, our policy is 16 weeks for male or female. That we're trying to value the human. And I think once you're on any kind of paternal leave, you say, actually, I want to be with this baby for a little bit. So,
of course.
Yeah, trying to put those European values at play within my own law firm.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, you don't understand it until you live it. When you're outside, I feel like it's most like young up and coming professionals are like, why do you need to take the time off? And you think like, oh, that's 6 weeks, 4 weeks. Oh my God, that's insane. And then you experience it and you're like, that's it. That's all the time. You need so much more than that. And you understand like just there's much more to life than just your passion, or not just your passion, but your profession.
Yeah. That babies aren't at all cooked at 1 month, nor are they ready to be given off to whomever to take care of. They still need some love and attention, and that I'd like to think that with regards to Europe, we've got a better vision for that is a little bit more understood. That we're not going to be there's the work to live or the live to work kind of thing, but the salaries in France are just so low. I like to sell the high points of France. I also want to be realistic with the low parts of France. The average salary in France is 2,000 euros. So if you're getting paid that little, might as well have a really high quality life. And I think that's in part why we see so many strikes. Last year was the reform on retirement, where Macron raised the age of retirement in France from 62, which is already very low, to 64, which is still pretty low even by European standards. And that for the French felt like it was violating the social contract, which was we don't get paid that much, but we're getting a lot of services, and so like, we've earned it by the age we're 64. So that debate is still raging within France. But yeah, it's that valuing of the other things outside of work that I feel like resonates more with me than my previous American lifestyle.
For someone who's, because there's so many ways that Americans can make their way over to France. What are some of the, Colette's fortunate, or we're fortunate, Colette is a Italian citizen, so we can leverage that. But let's say you have someone who wants to maybe spend some time abroad. Maybe it's a student or someone who's retiring. What are some of the options that you recommend or that are available to Americans?
Great question. And even before I mention the various visas, what I want to say is that it's very doable. For a person who wants to live in France, there's usually a visa that we can find for them. So there's basically 4 routes into France, via studies, via work, via relationship, or via the long stay visitor visa. And visitor visa ends up being the route for about half of my clients. It's for a person who's not looking for a French job or having French clients. That can then end up being a good route for them to come into France. If they can have housing, they can have their finances, if they can have health coverage, then they can manage to get this long stay visitor visa in relatively short order. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks to prepare any given visa application. The maximum amount of processing time is 3 weeks for any visa application once submitted. And for that visitor visa, it's 8 days. So the fastest I've ever seen a woman and I met on February 3rd for consultation. By February 28th, she had her visa in her passport already ready to move to France and live what I call her best French life. But my advice, Scott, to your question, depends on the age of the person. So a person between ages 20 to 30, I'm either thinking of I'm usually thinking of the student route, coming in either to do language classes to get good at French, because we could all be better at French, or to pursue master's degrees, because that was my route, and it's one of the best ways to enter the French labor market. A person maybe 30 plus to consider that long stay visitor visa, including, retirees. That could also be a good route in. And for those who are ambitious and looking to open a company in France, I end up recommending the entrepreneur visa. So depends on the person's profile, depends on the best route in, but there's usually a way to make the move happen.
Now, do all of the visas, in order to process them, do you have to apply before you go to France, or do you apply for any once you arrive?
So I usually say there's about roughly 30 categories, give or take, of visas. And 29 of them are filed from abroad, from the French consulate, let's say in the US. And that the one that you just show up here as a tourist and then you make your situation once you're here is the spouse of an EU national, because EU nationals are allowed to move around Europe and bring their spouse with them, and then show up as tourists and get a local status from the local prefecture.
Okay. And how does it work with the prefectures? Because they're all over the country, and I've heard that some might be a little more difficult than others. Why is that? How is that? How does that all work?
Yeah, so it's almost like something like on the US side, the state level and state governments, or on the county level and county governments, they're about the size of a county. So if you take the French map of the metropolitan French territory, the hexagon as they call it, there's 95 prefectures in there. And so Paris is the one that's like a city and it's its own prefect, département. It's big enough. It's very important that so they get their own prefecture. But otherwise, it's usually by region. So like the region around Nice has the Nice prefecture. Now, the challenge of the prefectures is that they're effectively they're always going to be under budget. They're always going to be understaffed and a little bit overworked. So for all the prefecture agents listening to this, which I'm sure is approximately 0, nothing against you, just that they're not listening in English to podcasts. They have all of my sympathies. That said, there is no prefecture that I love, and I like to say that Paris is the least worst prefecture. So they're most reactive, they're most likely to reply to emails. The Nice prefecture is at the bottom of my list, and it's either that they're, and it's not they might be voting 40% Marine Le Pen, or that they're out in the sun drinking in their cafe while the dossiers are stacking tall. But for whatever reason, for example, on naturalization to become French, it takes 18 months in Paris. It takes 4 years down in Nice. So we do see discrepancies between the processing times of various applications.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
if someone, I'm trying to think like what's the typical, like a lot of ours are families. We have families who might be thinking of wanting to spend time abroad. Either maybe it's to move abroad, or what's the typical recommendation you might have for let's just say us. Okay, let's say Colette's not an Italian citizen. What would you say? You've got a family of 3. and they're, hey, I want to go over for maybe a year, maybe 18 months to try it out. What's the best thing you recommend?
Well, the first thing I'd want to say is that you may think it's for 18 months, but there's very few folks that once they move here to France think about moving back. Some do, and sometimes it's usually when they do move back, sometimes it's connected to language, that they just didn't feel like it's stuck linguistically, or it was just too kind of a hard to overcome, that their dentist, the baker, the roofer person, that they are talking to them in French. But when people make the move here to France, it's often for a 12-month tester or 24 months, and then they figure out that once they're here, they like the temperature of the water and they prefer to stay. So a very typical profile would be, for the whole family to file for that long stay visitor visa. So the parents would get it as adults, the children would get it as minors. In France, they actually want you to enroll your kids in French public school. So sometimes my clients are asking me that question, like, am I allowed? I'm not like working in France, so I'm not necessarily paying for the schooling system or whatnot. Maybe they want me to be more like homeschooled or like one foot outside. But the French have a very different mentality when it comes to school, that they're a little bit phobic to homeschooling, but that also that they see schooling as a republicanizing, a Frenchifying experience. So that in America, and this is one big cultural difference, we think of ourselves very often as Irish American, Jewish American, Mexican American. And in France, they don't like that. They call that communautarisme, when there's different communities. What they're striving for as a national goal is for everyone to be French, Republican, of the République. And so they see school as a mechanism to make everyone share those Republican values, Republican as in the French Republic, not as in like Democrat Republican. And so so you can move here with your family, get your kids enrolled in French school. Sometimes my clients are thinking about, the American school in Paris, the British school in Paris, some of these maybe fancier private schools. And what I've seen is that in French public school, your kid will learn French. And if you put your kid in, the American school in Paris, they might not learn French, and they might be able to sing La Marseillaise after 5 years of being here, but not have acquired fluency in French. And children's minds are so sponge-like, they can always pick up the languages much better than the parents ever will when it comes to the language. So one of the other aspects to your question is where they're going to move in France. For my Americans, it's very often to Paris. For my British clients, it's very often to the countryside. But that the two major hubs where Americans often move to is Paris or Nice. For the more adventurous Americans, they might pick a mid-sized livable city like Tours or Annecy or Toulouse or Aix-en-Provence. But that it's a pretty safe bet to pick a major city because they will have a thriving expat community. And if you don't mind, Scott, I'm just going to keep on monologuing for a quick second because I'm
loving it. Yeah.
At the same time. That I've made a YouTube video about how to befriend the French because I find it very hard to do, maybe harder than it should be. That I find that oftentimes the French made their friends in high school and then in college, and then they had made a second wave of friends when they all had kids. But other than that, it's pretty hard to get French friends because if you're in your 20s and they're in their 20s, they might be your top friend in your city, but you're their third-ranked friend because they still have their high school buddies around. So it can be very tricky to get integrated with the French versus this ready-made American expat community that's there in Paris, that's there in Nice, of folks like you who speak English, who get your references to Friends and Seinfeld, who understand what you're going through because they probably also went through that as well. And that's a ready-made community, people also looking for friends. So in spite of myself, I'm a lot more attached to the expat community here than I thought I was going to be in making this move here to France.
Have you found it easy to make friends?
With the expats, yes. With the French, challenging. You can plug in various ways. I think joining local clubs, like I'm on my small town's volleyball team. There's certain French that like musical theater, and musical theater is always a great way to make friends. So if you can find what you're passionate about, whether it's writing or a sport, a running club or what have you, there's ways to plug in. If you do have kids, making playdates with their kids can be the way to make that connection. Religious communities can also be a really good way to break down those barriers and befriend the French. Workplace friends, I'm not sure the extent to which you can ever truly be friends with your workplace colleagues because you already see them too much. So yeah, it can be challenging. And I think there's a difference in stranger culture between how we as Americans do it and how the French do it. So we as Americans, it's not unusual to ask the person on the plane sitting next to you what they're reading. We're here, we're on the plane for 6 hours. We'll keep it light. The French were invaded by Nazis. And so, the apartment complex, there's a code to get in, and then there's a second door, and then you go up the flight, and then they have their own door with the key. And I think someone's grandmother, they're told them to not talk to strangers. And so then there's just this difference in mentality. It's harder for us to break through and get past that stranger realm to become intimate with the French versus vice versa. If a French person moves to America, they're always talking about how ebullient and friendly Americans are.
We've heard it compared, this was about the Swiss, but I think it compares here as well about the French, that they're kind of like coconuts. It's hard to crack in, but once you do, they're soft on the inside, whereas the Americans are like peaches, where they're really soft on the outside, but if you try to penetrate deeper, there's a pit there.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Not to pick on the French, but maybe they're like rocks. They're hard on the outside and then hard on the inside. It's just hard to break through.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, what else do you think that Americans maybe misunderstand about French culture?
The importance of language. That we as Americans were raised with a certain mentality that we are at the center of the universe, that we were on the moon and we won all these wars and whatever. We invented. Insert this various thing. So we have American culture, we've got American songs, we've got American literature. And to defend us for a certain extent, we don't necessarily need a passport to have a great time. Coming from San Diego, you can have a trip to Las Vegas and then the Grand Canyon and then San Francisco and then Hawaii and Yosemite. We don't necessarily need to leave the country to see wonderful, extraordinary things. Versus France, which is 17 times smaller than the US, which is smaller than the state of Texas. If you're in France, you take a 3-hour train ride to be in Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany. So many different countries are just out of arm's reach. And they have American culture too. They did watch Friends, even if Chandler didn't really translate into French. And so, but unlike, let's say, the Italians, for example, I think the Italians know that they're not at the center of the universe. I think the French have just enough justification to believe that they might be at the center of the universe with their own rappers and their own films and their own literature and philosophers, that they aren't so well raised in learning English. And so, and that the teaching style in France is a little bit stricter, such that they were taught, if you're not perfect in English, don't open your mouth. So they're a little bit more afraid to go outside their comfort zone and speak English. So their safety zone is speaking French. And we as Americans are historically terrible at foreign languages. And so we're not used to picking up at a young age, a language at a young age, because maybe we didn't need to. And so what they're looking for is for you to speak to them in French, and they're going to be soft. They're going to become that coconut. And maybe that's how you get past that outer shell, is by having great party French and not just restaurant French. And so that's why one of the major points that I raise with my Americans is get great at French. Invest in French. If you want to live here, work on your accent because it's not good enough. Work on your vocabulary because it's not wide enough. Watch the French films, watch French television, French news, read Le Monde. Put your films into French with some subtitles so you can see, what are the French talking about? How do they use their words? That is, I think, the biggest key towards unlocking the heart of the French.
What have you seen people who have success with that? Like, obviously those tools you just gave, but like, what's the time? Like if there's an adult, I should ask, have you had adults who have had success transitioning to French culture?
Yeah. Generally, if we're talking about the linguistic side of things, I think anyone can, work on languages. I think it's one of those linear skills where the more hours you put into it, the more payoff you're going to get out from it. And then, of course, the younger you are, the more your brain is more apt to acquire foreign languages. And so that can certainly help. But it's going to be the onus is on any person moving here to France to realize that we're no longer, this is not Kansas anymore. We do have to step out of our comfort zone and realize that this is it's a foreign system with a foreign banking system, with foreign tax returns, with foreign, everything, foreign healthcare system. So what we're used to seeing and the way that we're used to seeing things done is totally different. And so it requires an openness that we're not used to having, I'd say. But having that openness can really open you up to beautiful life-changing experiences, which is, for me, what makes moving abroad all worth it. Now, I think I want to add on 2 more things to that. When you use brain, they create synapses and they create links that weren't there before. And so I like to think that I'm actually smarter in France than I was had I just been American Daniel staying in San Diego, because I'm spending the whole day seeing how the French would have said something, or different words for what, how they would frame it. And then I can make connections that I didn't otherwise see. Yeah, so I think the fact that we're here, it makes it helps us out, and then just seeing the world in a different manner. So I don't like the word trash can. Can is very nasal, and in French it's poubelle.
Poubelle.
C'est belle la poubelle. And life is just slightly more charming if you're doing the whole thing in a foreign language. It's kind of like a fun, like the code on the back of your cereal box is if you're living that all day long.
That's amazing. It's interesting you say you feel smarter because of the foreign language. There's actually a study of Nobel Prize winners, and the likelihood that they would win a Nobel Prize went up. Like if they were an actor, it was like 10-20x. If they did woodworking, it was like 5x. So it's like if they were just a scientist, the likelihood of them being Nobel Prize winners wasn't that great versus if they were cross-functional in there, because it allowed them to see the world differently. And so it aligns exactly with what you're saying, is you can see the world differently in a more complex and nuanced way.
Yeah, it's almost like either moving sideways to move forward, or maybe even taking a step back to move forward. Maybe it's taking a step back as an appropriate metaphor, because you might feel and sound dumber in French. Like the sentences that you can come across with are a little bit more basic in their construction, but your brain is working harder to make those than maybe those complex and fluid sentences that you're spitting out in English. Yeah.
So Daniel, I want to go back. You touched a little bit about this. French want the kids in the school system. Now, for someone looking to move, what else are let's say Americans come over for that like year, let's say 12 to 18 months, and they're getting the visa. Do they get access to healthcare? What are the other services that they would get access to, or would they need to, insurance is the big thing, school's another big thing. Am I missing anything? Would they get access to those, or do they have to pay privately?
Yeah. So in France, they have this radical lefty notion that healthcare is a human right. And so that means that any person who lives here in France for more than 3 months can qualify for French public health care, and that's called the carte vitale. And this is mine. And so then the way that works is, like, let's say a person's entering France as a student or as a worker or as a spouse of a French person, they can arrive and immediately file for it. For my clients that are on that visitor visa, they can wait 3 months and then file for the healthcare. And then it's France. You file for it, you get approved, within a couple months, and you can already get reimbursements. And then it takes about 8 more months to get that carte vitale in the mail, because France is historic for its bureaucracy. And if it wasn't, then I wouldn't have a job. So here we are. But
I think the word bureaucracy comes from France, right? Because it had to be the person who had the files in the bureau.
Yeah. It's a French word, bureau.
Yeah. And it was the person who had the files with the bureaucrat and had bureaucracy. I just read those recently, and I was blown. Sorry.
Very good. And so healthcare certainly is a part of the package. The 3 major questions that I always want to make sure my clients are wrapping their head around is, what is the right visa for my way into France? Like, what's the best, the route for me to make this move? How does healthcare work, and how does taxes work? So on the healthcare side of things that we were just saying, with you can qualify for and get public healthcare after you've made the move here to France. On the tax side of things, sometimes people are unaware how this all works, but in short, if you're living here for more than half the year and using French sidewalks more than US sidewalks, and firefighters and national security more than the US side, then yes, France does want you to file taxes here. And on French taxes and worldwide earned income also filed here in France. But that there's a beautiful Franco-American tax treaty that protects us from double taxation. So we either pay in one place or the other, but not in both. And so it usually ends up working out. It can be slightly higher than US taxes, sometimes after federal and then state tax. It can even be a little bit of a wash, but French taxes are slightly higher than the US side of things. What we're getting out of it is, in part, that healthcare as a human right, that everyone has it and is in the system, and no one's getting excluded for pre-existing conditions. And paying for all these wonderful things that we believe in here in France.
So just quick summary: the Americans come over, even if it's not a citizen, they're here for 3 months. They get insurance and access to the school systems. They don't have to. Yes. So.
And if you're staying more than 6 months, then you are paying taxes. But say, because of this treaty, and I know this gets into tax law and all of that, but because of this treaty, as an American citizen, I mean, I'm always going to pay U.S. taxes as an American citizen, no matter where I live. Yeah. However, I can pay U.S. taxes, and I perhaps don't have to pay the higher French tax rate, but I can still access these social services. Is that correct?
Yeah, let's unpack it. And I'm sure your viewers are glued to their seat about international tax policy.
If they have to
So,
pay more, then
well,
maybe.
yeah, well, tread lightly. It's good you're talking with the lawyer. So the way that it works is like, let's say for that visitor visa where a person's not having a French work contract, that they say revenue earned in France, zero. I'm on this visitor visa. I'm not taking a French job. Revenue earned abroad is 60,000. So then you file that, you pay that here in France at the relevant, effective tax rate here in France. And then you turn around to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service on the US side, and you say, hey, look, there's this Franco-American tax treaty, which talks about either the foreign tax credit or the foreign earned income exclusion. One or two of these mechanisms are then reducing your tax burden on the US side, so that you will still, as an American, always file on the US side and declare an amount, and then it might be an immediate tax credit that reduces your adjusted gross income down to zero. So that if you are in fact living here in France full time, that you're declaring both locations, but then paying on the French side with the French rates.
Okay, so I think a lot of our followers have said, sounds lovely, but I don't want to pay 50% taxes or whatever the assumed tax rate is in France. So I think it's really important for people to know that you don't have to pay a higher tax rate. And of course, that's depending on where your income is earned, I assume.
It was the opposite of that. So the person is paying the French taxes. Taxes usually are somewhere around 20 to 30% in France. So the first 10,000 you earned is taxed at zero. The money you've earned from 10,000, 20,000 is taxed. 25,000 is taxed at 10%. 25 to 75,000 is taxed at 30%, and above 75,000 is taxed at 40%. So depending on which bucket the euro is earned in, it might be taxed at 0% for the first 10,000 and so forth. So if you're earning 60,000, your effective tax rate might be 20%. So that's effectively how it works out. So you are subject to French tax rates rather than US because you're filing here, because you're living here, because you're using the French systems.
Okay.
We had a lot of people wrote in some questions online.
Great.
And one question we had to do with what French islands? What was the exact question?
Yes. About getting visas for French-owned islands like Reunion Island, where you lived. Do you apply to France, or do you apply to that actual country? And do you apply before or after you move?
Yeah, so it's part of the visa application. When you fill out the form, you indicate where you're moving to. Is it mainland France, or is it one of these French overseas territories, which kind of have a legal relationship to France, similar to, for us in America, Guam or Puerto Rico, that they are part of the country. The people that are living there feel like less than full citizens because Macron, for example, was down in Mayotte. Mayotte is a French overseas territory. It's down by Madagascar. And there was a terrible cyclone that came through there. And some of what Macron was saying to the residents there made it almost sound like he was saying you should be thankful that you're French, because it would otherwise be the Comoros Islands, which is a different country, which is impoverished. So yeah, it is in the visa application that one gets to decide where one's filing for, and then of course you're still picking on what basis. Are you a student? Are you an entrepreneur? Are you family based or what have you? Yeah.
Okay. Now, if someone does want to retire, what is that best visa that you would recommend for them?
The long stay visitor visa.
Okay. Now, with that, can they, if they're earning any income, say on investment properties, even in the States, would that be okay? Can they still qualify for that visa with some type of income coming in?
Yeah. And so your example is a really good example. Investment income on the US side. If you look at the Franco-American tax treaty, it talks about there's certain things that don't make it over to France. So when it comes to rent, when it comes to capital gains, when it comes to US Social Security for those who are retired, those stay US taxable events. Those are not getting taxed here in France. So for a retiree that's moving here that has Social Security, or for a person who's moving over here with a stock portfolio that's on the US side, those stay US taxable events. Those aren't even brought onto the French tax returns. What the French are looking to tax is salary, so revenue generated.
Okay. That's great to know.
Yeah.
So someone can move to France, and if they're retiring, move to France, access this wonderful social services and healthcare system.
And basically never pay French taxes.
Yeah.
right?
So it depends on what's appearing on their French tax return. But for example, the healthcare side of things, for a person that's on that visitor visa, they get a bill in about December saying, how much have you earned worldwide? We're going to take a fraction of that, and that's what you're going to be paying into to cover the cost of healthcare. So that usually works out to a few €1,000. Versus on the US side, private health insurance. My brother-in-law, he moved from Scotland to San Diego. He does Ironman competitions and he has to pay out of pocket $16,000 annually for healthcare. And that might even seem as a reasonable amount. Here on the French side, to get public healthcare, it's a few €1,000s. So even if a person's showing up here in France as a retiree, for example, they are able to benefit from the healthcare system, and it's fair because they're paying into the system as well.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. That clears up, I mean, so much, because I think as an American, I mean, we've been in France, we understand it, but like most Americans would just be shocked because they hear that. Well, when we started to move over, we had lots of people say, well, you can't get the health care. You have to work. You have to do this. And it is such a foreign concept. But once you understand the principles behind it, it totally makes sense that it's a right for everyone there. And then we kind of get into the nuanced details of, yes, for example, the retiree example, you're not paying taxes into it, but you are going to pay for the system afterwards based on your global income that you have coming in.
Right, yeah. And that it's fair one way or the other. So an employee is paying for it within deductions out of their payslip. An entrepreneur like myself is contributing directly into French Social Security, and those people on that visitor status are able to get healthcare because they are paying some kind of flat amount at the end of the year. So, and then even then, and this is where it's to get even unfair to the advantage of Americans, that sometimes France chooses to not tax them at all for healthcare, saying you've contributed to your own social security system your whole life. So you've probably paid into and worked and you deserve some kind of healthcare system on the US side. So you can benefit from healthcare here in France as a retiree, and we're not even going to ask you to pay for it.
Wow.
And so then we've had clients saying, I'm looking to pay for my healthcare that I'm getting for free. Where do I go about doing that? And I asked a social security lawyer, and he said that you can't give them money. They don't, France you can only give them money if they've billed you for it. Otherwise you can't just hand them money. So that maybe is even a loophole in the system that I think France should eventually take care of to make things fair, but it works to the advantage of Americans who are making that move here to France.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, what does it take to become a French citizen?
I have my wallet open from that carte vitale question, so this is my French ID card. So this takes a lot more, I'd almost want to call it an eggs in a basket metaphor. France wants you to have your eggs be in the French basket. So if you have a spouse, the spouse lives with you here in France, you've got minor children, they're here. And if you have a job, that the job is here in France, it's a French job, whether it's as an employee or as an entrepreneur. They want you to speak good French, intermediate French. They want you to not be a criminal. So that's important to note, that you have been here for at least 5 years, you filed taxes for at least 3 years, you've been on the job market for at least 18 months. Those are the various factors that go into becoming French, just to qualify. And then you submit, and then they have to process and approve it. And then halfway through the naturalization process, they interview you, and that's where they're asking you in French all these hardcore questions. What is the national motto of France? Do either of you know the national motto of France?
We do not. Do you?
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Fraternity, yeah. Fraternity.
Yeah. And then they might ask you, what does that mean? And then they might ask you, if you had to add a fourth value onto that, what would that be? And the right answer is laïcité, the separation of church and state, because they really value that here in France. They like to ask a lot of French cultural questions, your favorite French food and so forth. That usually goes well. And then it's a waiting game until they naturalize you, at which point they give you a French birth certificate, as if you're being reborn a French citizen. And then America lets you have as many passports as you like. France does as well. So you can, of course, be a dual national Franco-American, as I am.
Wow, well, that's wonderful. Now, what if someone wants to work remotely? Is France an option for them to move to for, say, a year, maybe more, but have their primary job still be in the US or another country? Is that a possibility?
So it's a great question, Colette, and it's the most important question that our law firm receives, in part because the internet's divided roughly half. Half say yes and half say no. So I'll give you my best arguments for why that is a possibility. Keep in mind that it is a complex situation. And this is the one question for which I say it might be good to talk with a lawyer like myself offline afterwards. But that, to give you the one sentence summary, is not my opinion. I'm just saying a sentence that the consulate has confirmed in writing that they believe it is authorized to telework in France for a non-French company on that long-stay visitor visa. The complexities around that are then, well, what does that mean from a social security standpoint? Where am I paying my social charges? And by that, I mean, where am I contributing to unemployment, disability, retirement, maternity leave, paternity leave, and so forth. And in theory, if you're a US national living here in France, working a US job, you're living here full time, so you're paying income tax. But the Social Security, if you got let go, you'd be on US unemployment. So your social charges staying on the US side. France hasn't yet really thought of that possibility because the idea of international teleworking is still kind of new. So out of COVID, a couple of countries developed the digital nomad visa. France didn't. And so they're kind of shoehorning a lot of these international teleworkers into this long stay visitor visa. And the consulate and the prefecture and the Ministry of the Interior are saying that it's okay. It also depends on the immigration expert that you talk to. Some don't agree with that assessment because they see it as, if you're living in France, you should be paying social charges on your work. And if you're working in France, you should be paying that here. But they're not going to give you a visa to be an entrepreneur and pay social charges here if your one activity is to be an employee of a US company. That's not entrepreneurship. And so it can start to become a catch-22. So what I do is I align my advice with the French consulate.
Okay. So it is possible, potentially.
Yeah. Just maybe not simple.
Right.
Yeah.
Do we have some other questions?
Yeah. So Susan Runs wants to know, if one spouse has a visa, can their child get a visa?
Yeah. So, for example, that visitor visa, you can get it for the adults and then for the children. If you're coming in as a worker, there's a thing called the talent passport, which France invented in 2016 to try to be innovative and bring the highly skilled worker here to France. I say try to because I like to tease France that it wants to be innovative, it's desperate to be innovative, and it's not that innovative. And so then they voted for Macron because they want the business friendly, and then they can't. They're trying their best to be innovative. It's a long process. And one of those routes to be innovative is to have that talent passport. So there's 10 subcategories of talent passport. Are you a talent passport, corporate creation or an investor? Are you a highly skilled employee getting hired by a French company? Are you an artist, internationally renowned? And if so, you can bring in your spouse automatically on a talent passport family and the kids. And the spouse can work in any manner whatsoever. So there can be ways to bring the whole family in. Depending on the visa category. And that usually shapes which advice for which category I tell the person to go for.
Okay. That's beautiful. And then I know from personal experience, but I would ask that you speak to this a little bit. If a person who has citizenship or a visa moves with their spouse and they need a spouse of an EU citizen visa, now this is the only visa in which someone moves prior to applying for their visa. How does that work? You just come into the country and say, I swear I'm just on a tourist visa.
Yeah. So like this could be Scott's example. If, you two were to move to France, that Colette would just show up as an Italian national and just be Italian. You'd have your passport. You could then take any job and just show them the photocopy of the ID page and just start working tomorrow. And that what you would do is register with the local town hall, the mairie, just declare that you exist. And so then they know how many heads to count to give like the apportionment of taxes to each given city. And that lets you vote once every 5 years in the French local elections and EU-wide elections. Then for Scott, you show up as a spouse of an EU national, as a tourist. You just kind of cruise through Charles de Gaulle Airport. You don't have to answer, they're not going to ask you questions. They don't ask questions at the Charles de Gaulle Airport, but you just show up, saying, here's my marriage certificate, here's my Italian wife, I'm good. And then within the first 90 days, you ask the local prefecture, like the Paris prefecture or the Nice prefecture, for that spouse of EU national residency permit. That was my category before I became French because my wife is German. And it is tricky because it's the one category that's filed for locally. And there's 95 prefectures. And up until a few years ago, each one had their own sauce. They all had their own little spin on how to do it and their own little checklist. They moved it online. So now it's theoretically a national checklist, but it's still not perfect because you're showing up here within 90 days, you're filing. Good. So you're legal, you filed on time, but they're not timely at the local prefecture. It's going to take them more than 3 months to process this thing. So your 90 days have come and gone now. You are here on French territory without anything in your name besides proof of filing an application, but that document doesn't give you legal status yet. Until they've received you, until they've processed it and approved it, then you get legal status. And then you can get a residency permit card. It can be for a 5-year card. It's free to get. It includes all work authorization. So long story, the big picture, you'll get it. and it'll work out and you'll have a great status. In the short term, you're sweating bullets because you're a little worried, how's this all working? And my job, half my job is to be good at my job and to get the right visa, whatever. The other half is to be a Mr. Rogers reassuring presence that it's all going to work out. It's going to come through. They're just a little bit slow because of the bureaucracy, and they're going to take a little bit of time, but you are going to get the thing.
I love it. Okay, we've had a lot of so much information about this process. I want to know, someone has, I don't know, let's just say someone watched Ratatouille or Midnight in Paris, and they want to learn about France. They want to become a Francophile like yourself. Let's say what would you guide them in the process? And let's say they've got at least 2 weeks to travel as well.
And in this hypothetical, are they coming to France or are they staying in America to kind of get excited and hyped?
Both.
Okay. Both. Yeah. Let's talk about the pre-flight Americans. Language is, I think, one of the best ways to get excited about the culture and the country. So I don't like Duolingo because it's just texting and languages are lived orally. So I like Rosetta Stone. I like the website iTalki, where you can exchange with a one-on-one native language speaker. The Alliance Française are in most major towns. You can go get, language classes there. And then, setting up an appetite of French films on Netflix, switching all the languages into French, reading Huffington Post, but in French, or, the French newspapers. Le Monde is is one of the best newspapers to start with. It's kind of like the New York Times of France. So to kind of get, wrapped into the culture of it. And then once you're here, yes, of course, explore Paris, but then also get out of Paris to see all the coolness that France has to offer, that there are these French overseas islands with, volcanoes and surfing, that there is Biarritz, which is in the Basque country of France, and that's like the French California. There's Nice, which is the French Florida. There's Grenoble in the Alps, which is like the French Colorado. There's so many different aspects to it. Those that love history might enjoy the beaches in Normandy. There is the Mont Saint-Michel, which is right on the border of Normandy and Brittany, and they both argue over whether it's Normand or Breton. They both want to claim it as their own. But yeah, just getting over here, and as an American, we're allowed 90 days in 180-day period as a tourist. So you could theoretically do 3 months in, 3 months out, 3 months in, 3 months out, without even dealing with a lawyer. You could just be a tourist, right? And it's for those people that want to spend more than 90 days at a time here in France, that want to think about getting a visa to make that move here to France. There's so many ways to make that move. For example, you can enroll in a language academy and have that be your student route in. And then you'll be taking, 20 hours of classes. There's some really cool schools down in the French Riviera where you can be, the lovely sites down there and also be learning French. So, and of course, it's relatively affordable, all things equal, because it's France. And because they have low salaries, the cost of living is slightly lower. That the starting price for bottled wine might be €4, €5. You buy a little hummus dip for €4, a baguette for €1, and then that's your evening on the Seine. You just chill out with the locals. So it's very affordable, it's very doable, and I think it's never been more accessible than nowadays with this visitor visa.
It's wonderful. And if people do want to reach out to you and potentially move to France for a longer period of time, where can they find you? How can they contact you and find that great information you were talking about on your YouTube?
Yeah. Honestly, I've got a website, danieltostado.com. They can write to me. There's a little message section at the bottom there, and we reply within a working day. And then it's not just me. So I want to make sure that the people watching this don't have this facade that, I've got a whole team now. We've got 15 people within this law firm helping people make that move to France. And a lot of them are people that have gone through that process themselves of coming into France, not belonging, finding the right visa, getting a better status, and then becoming insiders themselves. I think the purpose of my law firm is to be the insider that helps outsiders become insiders. And sharing France is with others who love France is such a privilege. And so, they're more than welcome to reach out, and I'm happy to help them make that move.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very informative. I know that a lot of our viewers will save this, and this is very usable for evergreen content. Hopefully that the laws don't change too much, but
yeah. Oh, I do have another question. Have you seen an uptick in interest in moving to France post-election in the United States?
I thought that question could turn one way or the other. It was either due to Emily in Paris.
Actually, both ways.
Both. Yeah, let's go both. Let's go light and dark.
But I think Emily in Paris is a perfect, didactic tool for us to kind of, or a framing tool to say, there is that sugary coated version of it, the beret version, beret wearing version of France, and then there's the actual concrete version of there's the Hollywood France, and then there's the reality France. With Trump winning, yes, I think people are a little bit more expressive of why they're actually moving to France. I think folks that want to move to France are usually more aligned with Democrats in any case. And so Trump winning usually means that the folks that don't like guns, that do like healthcare, that value language and culture and diversity as a strength and so forth. Very often Californians align with French values inherently and want to make that happen. When I moved to France in 2016, I would have written to me saying, I really like America. I went to law school in America. I like the Constitution, all these cool nerdy things, but I also really love France. So I want to make France my lifestyle. Maybe if I was writing to myself today, I would say, I really like France, and I feel like US is changing in some way that it's not that I recognize it less and less, but maybe what it is. I mean, Trump won the popular vote. Trump won this fair and square by the Electoral College, by any way you count this, Trump won the thing. And so for better or for worse, that's what America is looking for, is Donald Trump back into the White House. And for those who do not feel that that resonates with them, a lot of these values that they do resonate with are here found in France. France is not, it's not heaven either, right? Because we've got around the bend, we might also have Marine Le Pen coming into power here in France. Like in every given country, it might be Netanyahu or down in Brazil or Putin, wherever. It's never guaranteed that you're not going to have those kind of leaders coming into power. I'm a bit off topic now. I think I'm afraid of that.
That's okay.
Nevertheless, those values are anchored into the Constitution. So, like, for example, Roe v. Wade was struck down not too long ago on the U.S. side after 50 years of being a very established case law. Trump was able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices that turned the balance in the bench. Of the 9 justices, now 6 have been appointed by conservative presidents. And so therefore that was a fundamental right, and then it got thrown over to the states, and then that changed what rights you have depending on what state you live in. France saw all that and they said, oh putain, and they constitutionalized the right to abortion in the French Constitution because of that. So rights don't always change on a day-to-day basis. Usually rights are a slow-moving ship. And in France, a lot of those rights that people that have voted Democrat align with are constitutionalized and concretized here on the French side.
Wow. And how fast did that happen just recently?
Yeah, that was within the past 2 years or so.
And what did it require to get that into the Constitution?
This is an interesting question because it was across the political spectrum that people did vote for that to become amended into the Constitution. And even for Marine Le Pen, who is the head of the far right here in France, it was, it wasn't down the party line like you might see on the US side of things. Because it's been such a fundamental right here in France, they were afraid of losing votes. So yeah, it was a matter of it being proposed in French, the National Assembly, the Assemblée Nationale, and then voting on it so that it can be added into the French Constitution.
So basically, it went through their House of Congress and the French Senate.
Yeah, okay. Exactly right.
Wow. Well, that's an interesting topic to end on.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it both ways. If one person wins in the U.S., this is a few months ago, then I'm leaving the country. And if the other person wins, I'm leaving the country. So yeah, I heard it both ways. And I was just really genuinely curious, like, are people doing it then?
And the great thing, as Americans, we do have the opportunity to make these decisions if you want to. If you do want to leave, you can do this. You're not stuck.
Yeah. Unlike, for example, Russian nationals moving here to France. So I've got nationalized a little bit of everywhere. When the Ukraine war happened, of course, we had Ukrainian refugees coming from Ukraine here into France. And then we also had Russian dissidents that had maybe donated money to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and that could not ever see themselves being in the Russian army invading Ukraine, and that they might even have family members in Ukraine. And then they're filing for asylum here in France. So, and of course, at my law firms helping both sides of that. The Ukrainians that want to live free, and the Russians that want to be able to have the liberty of freedom of expression, which of course they have here in France. We, as Americans, have a great privilege of being born American, that we are coming from, in my opinion, a great country, and having the option to move to other great countries. That's kind of how I see our moves. Other people maybe are moving from more dire straits, that they move from Iran and they don't love it and they don't want to go back, come what may. France is their destiny. And so America is always there in case we needed it. And in case we need to take care of our elderly parents or what have you, settle at home, we need to fly back. it's always going to be there. It's always going to be a place of freedom, but that we're only living one life, and for me, I want to live the best version of my life, and I feel like the best version of my life is here in France, and so that's why I made the choice to move here and to stay here, and I haven't regretted it.
That's amazing. Daniel, thank you so much. Your passion for France and your knowledge of the law has been amazing.
Yeah,
I mean, it's been very
eye-opening, and I think really helpful for the people listening at home.
I think it will be very helpful. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. These are great free ways to support this podcast. Also, please subscribe to this podcast on both Spotify and Apple. On both of those platforms, you can leave us up to a 5-star review, which would help us out greatly. Please also check out the sponsors mentioned in today's episode. That's the best way to support this show. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please put those in the comment sections in YouTube. And yes, we do read all the comments.